Welcome everyone to the first history-themed video on my channel. And this one's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. It's a very important one, and World War II and the Third Reich in general can hardly be discussed enough in trying to help us find solutions or things that we should watch out for when we're talking about current day politics, as well as analyzing everything that's happened in the past after the events of World War II themselves unfolded. So this is gonna be World War II, how the Allies helped legitimize Hitler, a case study of the declaration of war against the United States of America. I've decided to focus on this speech that Hitler gave in the December of 1941 in front of the German parliament, because I think it illustrates quite well how, in fact, Hitler got legitimized or got help from the side of the Allies without them necessarily even meaning to do so. So we're gonna take a look at that. It's a speech in which Hitler speaks about the state of Europe at the current time, at the current point in time, and gives detailed reasoning for why he went to war with Poland, France, Russia, the Soviet Union, and the United States of America after that speech is given. Also, of course, I'm well aware that Hitler's plans inherently were evil, and he was always gonna wage a big war in Europe. In this speech, he gives some legit reasons and some made-up reasons that he just puts out there to legitimize his warmongering. But all these things that I'm gonna talk about in this video, it's 5 main points of how the Allies helped him seem more legitimate in Germany, and how his declarations of war didn't exactly look as well as evil and as inherently aggressive by the Germans as they probably were or should have been, because the Allies really made it a bit too easy for Hitler to first get to power and then spread his power all throughout Europe. Okay, and then with that being said, let's dive right into it. So the first part I want to focus on is his explanation on how the German-Polish relationship developed, and how, yeah, pretty much everything, all the agreements, all the conflicts with Poland in the 30s came to be. Hitler starts this topic off by talking about how he demanded back ex-German territories from Poland, and this is a big talking point in Germany at this point in time. Pretty much all the German politicians before Hitler and up to Hitler were in agreement that this part of the Treaty of Versailles was not justified, and that there were German territories, primarily in Poland, that needed to be reincorporated into the Reich. And these territories that Hitler wanted were as follows. He wanted Danzig, the city, to go to Germany, and to have a popular vote held in Silesia under international supervision, where the people themselves would decide if they wanted to belong to Germany or to the Polish state. And he claimed that ethnic Germans were being persecuted in those areas of Poland, which is why he felt a need and a mandate to protect them from that persecution. This offer, or those demands by Hitler, were of course refused by Poland, and this was a smart move by them, considering how little the Allies did when Hitler annexed Austria or territories in Czechoslovakia completely illegally. Even though the Allies time and time again tried to draw a line in the sand and say, you get this much but not more, Hitler went over it and didn't care. So even if he had lost that referendum in, say, Silesia, then he of course would have just took the territory anyways and claimed the election was somehow illegitimate. And at that point in time, Poland could have just imagined what would happen to them. The Allied community probably, again, wouldn't do much to stop him from taking that territory, and therefore they did not respond to these demands made by Hitler. And Hitler considers this act of Polish disrespect, as well as allegedly the Polish people ramping up the persecution and the hate against the German people that lived in those areas of Poland. And those were the reasons that Hitler claims he declared war against the Poles. So what could the Allies have done differently about that situation? They could have helped the Poles. Now, not only the German politicians, also some politicians in the Allied countries of Britain and France were aware that those territories should have, in many people's eyes, still belong to Germany, but were not taken away from them as a form of, well, as a real logical sense. You know, those territories weren't really more Polish than German, but that was supposed to be a punishment. And if you implement such a measure simply as an act of punishment, then of course years down the line the next generations can say, well, I mean, that's not a wrongdoing that we committed necessarily, and also those German people that live in those areas, they didn't commit those wrongdoings. So there was at least a partially legit claim of Germany to those areas, and therefore many allies were not not willing to put to stage a war, or to provoke a war over just those few areas in Poland where there were many German people still living there. The second part is Germany's relationship with France and Great Britain. Hitler in this speech blames Churchill for the bad relationship with Great Britain. Hitler himself wouldn't have attacked Great Britain. In theory, of course, war with Great Britain was always going to be inevitable if Hitler wanted to attack Poland, or at least if he wanted to go to war with France, which he would for sure have done simply because of the territories of Alsace and Lorraine. He would have always taken those territories, and the French, of course, wouldn't have simply given them to Hitler in some form of treaty, but he would have had to wage a war, and then the Brits would always have gotten involved into that kind of war. So the war was inevitable, but Hitler didn't specifically want to attack Great Britain, at least not before taking care of all of mainland Europe, mainly France and Russia on the other side. So he blames Churchill, his politics, his getting involved with the other countries in Europe, for the bad relationship between Germany and Britain. And he says that Churchill keeps instigating fear of German takeover in neutral countries that Hitler isn't even interested in. Now, those claims, again, are somewhat justified by Hitler, because Churchill and other allies always warned everybody to not to cooperate with Hitler too much, or to be wary of Hitler, that he was gonna invade some neighboring countries. In some situations, that was a justified fear, of course, and the allies were right in pointing that out, but in some territories Hitler maybe wouldn't have attacked them, and therefore he could use those attempts by the allies to contain him, and point out that this was in fact only a conflict that they even provoked. He wasn't even gonna deal with those territories that they suggested he was gonna take over. And secondly, it was France and Great Britain that declared war on Germany after settling its issue with Poland. And again, I'm not saying that all those things that the Allies did were wrong, because of course at some point they had to declare war on Hitler, or else he was just going to take all of Europe. But they did declare war on Germany, and therefore Germany was de facto the defender. At least they were on the defensive in the war against the Brits and the French at first, while they were still dealing with Poland. And therefore it was easy for Hitler to just claim, well, he only wanted to take what was rightfully German's stuff in Poland, according to his opinion, and that was a really easy to market idea in Germany. The populace would have just believed that, because I mean, of course there were many German people still living in Poland, and those territories were German just a few couple of years before that, about 20 years before that. And so the Allies declaring war on Germany, just over Germany, taking what's rightfully theirs, again in air quotes of course, is easy to market with some rhetoric as an aggressive act by the Allies in that case. It was obvious beforehand, of course, that they were gonna declare war on Germany if they attacked Poland, but Hitler himself did not pick that war with France and Great Britain, at least not actively. He of course did it because it was implied. What supports this idea again is that the Allies had let Hitler take stuff before that without acting. He just took Czechoslovakia, and that's a big thorn in the side for the Allies later on after the war, because the Czechs felt so disrespected by the Allies, who they were promised help by, but when Hitler simply marched in there, they didn't do anything. And that backstabbing pretty much of the Allies in this little state of Czechoslovakia, that set a really bad precedent for Hitler to just do whatever he wanted. Thirdly, let's look at the Soviet Union. Hitler's first assertion in declaring war on the Soviet Union, which in turn was a war that he declared, his first assertion was that this war was going to be inevitable. And this is a question with great consensus among current-day historians. He's pretty much right in assuming that a war with the Soviet Union would have come either way. Had he not chosen it, Stalin surely would have attacked him somewhere down the line. This, of course, still makes him the aggressor in this war, but he points out that knowing that the Russians were gonna attack him, it was better for him to strike first. And this idea is supported by Churchill, who Hitler claims keeps asking for Stalin to open up a second front on the eastern border of Germany, so Britain could get some relief in the western part of the war. And of course, if you're Hitler in this situation, now Hitler of course wanted to attack the Russians, but remember again, that's not how he marketed it. He marketed this as a more defensive measure since the Russians were gonna attack Germany anyways. And if you're Hitler and you're at war, you've taken out France, and the British are still there and they're refusing to surrender. Now they start contacting neutral countries in theory and asking them to join the war, and then it's not just any neutral country, but it's the Soviet Union, who you know likes to attack its neighbors, who you know has imperialistic ambitions. Then it seems reasonable. You can, again, to your people at home, you can market this idea as, look, those enemies of us who declared war on us are now trying to get other people involved in the war against us, and it's looking like they might join them. So Hitler again has a really easy time parlaying this into a justified reason for attacking the Soviet Union. And just what I just mentioned before, the Soviet Union of course had invaded the neighbors left, right and center, so it would not have been a big surprise if Stalin had been the one to attack Hitler anyways. Hitler also claims that the Soviet Union would have probably invaded Germany already in 1940 if the Wehrmacht hadn't taken out Paris as quickly as they did, and if France hadn't gone down so quickly. Hitler claims that Stalin would have probably already taken that opportunity if there was a prolonged period of time like in World War I, where Hitler didn't just take out France in an instant. But of course the Germans took far less time with France than anyone could have anticipated, and therefore the Soviet Union did not attack. Who knows, he might have been right on that assertion. I personally don't really think that Stalin would have attacked Germany that early, even if it had taken Hitler a bit of a longer time. But it's not something that we can clearly for sure say if they would not have done. So it seems like a reasonable statement at the time. Also, the next thing is Hitler did not only say that the Soviet Union would have invaded them, but he pointed out how ruthless and at times brutal the Soviet Union went about their conquered territories, how they were not at all respectful with the people they covered, they conquered, and therefore he sows doubt and sows fear in the German people of the big bad Russian army who was gonna roll over the land, and Hitler portrays himself kind of as the savior who struck while the iron was hot and made the first move and thereby defended the German people from that brutal, crushing Russian invasion that would have inevitably come. Also on the topic of the Soviet Union, he introduces in this speech this idea of Germany as the defenders of Europe. Now, he talks about this for about 10 to 20 minutes. It's a big concept that he lies down, and it has some historic flaws, but it's, again, if you're talking to a population or to a parliament that's not primarily made up of historians, most of what he says here sounds kind of legit. He claims that there are select peoples that are destined to fend off the foes of Europe. And he describes Europe not as a geographically defined place, but as the community of all nations with ancient Greece's values. And he claims that foreign invaders were trying to destroy that idea of Europe, those ancient values, and they were always held at bay by these great nations of Europe who took it into their own hands to defend all the European peoples against those outside invaders. He traces this back to Greece versus Persia. He also mentions that torch then being taken and passed on to Rome versus the Carthaginians and the Huns, which of course in terms of Carthage wasn't a very defensive war after all, but he spins the idea that way. Then he also mentions Spain versus the Arabs and the Reconquista, where all those European powers come together or amass a big army and keep the outside invaders, these outside forces, out of Europe. And those values, those European values of the ancient Greece, how he calls it, and also simply Christianity, always need to be defended by one big empire, he claims. And he also asserts that Germany now carries this torch of defending those values. He supports this idea by claiming that countless volunteers from all across Europe and the territories that were conquered by the Germans in World War II voluntarily joined the German army in trying to fend off the Soviet Union in that aggressive act that Germany was actually undertaking at that point in time. Now, the fourth relationship is the one with the United States of America and Germany. And this one is the one where the Allied powers probably committed the biggest mistakes and gave Hitler the biggest ground to stand on in terms of claiming that it wasn't his aggression. Now, first he starts off by talking about the German-American relationship before everything went bad. He said that the United States themselves are responsible for everything that went bad in the in the German-United States relationship. And he says that Germany, in fact, has always been a rather good partner with the United States. He suggests that Germany and USA should have, in fact, been allies at that point in time. And he starts off by saying that there are Germanic roots in America. And, of course, many of the immigrants that founded that country, that nation, came from Germany. Even today, there's a huge German population still in the United States. He also says that there was no German interference in American affairs all throughout the last couple of centuries, and of course the German Empire had always interfered in some place or another, tried to make colonial politics, but in the grand scheme of things he is rather right with that, because other powers such as Spain, France, and England had meddled way more in American affairs than Germany ever had. So he said, man, we respected your Monroe Doctrine. We respected your wish of Europeans keeping themselves out of your affairs. Now, why do you have to get into our affairs? We were always good partners. That's what he says, at least. And he also says the Germans and Americans had fought side by side in wars before, and therefore there should be some sort of a bond between those peoples. Also, the form of government in Germany and the United States is more similar than that between the United States and the Soviet Union, which is communism in the Soviet Union, and some sort of a republic in both Germany and the United States. And there's a key distinction here, because just like the United States, Germany is one of those few countries that just loves to stress, at that point in time, of course, that they're not a democracy, they're a republic. And Hitler himself is not the greatest fan of a free democracy, but he keeps mentioning in his speech that Germany is a republic that's led by an authoritarian leader, but he still considers Germany a functioning republic. And the US, of course, is a republic as well at that point in time. And those things should, according to Hitler, make Germany and the United States more similar and more friendly with each other, as opposed to that other political regime over in the Soviet Union, which at that point in time America is already supporting in the war efforts. And of course, in the end, the American aggression in World War I against Germany, as Hitler calls it, of course, he says that was the ultimate tipping point in their relationship. Germany had been a good partner before that, but America decided to join in against Germany in World War I, and therefore broke the trust in that relationship and soured it ultimately. He moves on to talking a bit more about Woodrow Wilson in general. He focuses a lot, although he doesn't specifically name it, on the 14 points of Wilson's at the end of World War I. The set of goals that he went into the negotiations of the Treaty of Versailles. And among those 14 points is the will of Wilson to restore the borders of Europe according to the ethnic distribution of the peoples. And Hitler calls that out as being hypocritical, and this is one of his best points in the entire speech, because Wilson, at the end of World War I, wants all the Belgian lands to be handed back to Belgium, all the French lands going back to France, Germany not gaining any of their territory, all the Polish people to be in a new country, the Italian borders to be exactly confined by where the Italian people live. But what Wilson also does is he cuts German areas where German majorities live out of Germany. And that goes against the idea that he says, that Wilson says, that peace in Europe can only be kept if the countries are confined by the ethnic borders of the peoples. But he goes against that rule in Germany in an act of trying to punish the Germans. Of course, this idea is way more driven by leaders such as the French. But Hitler points this out as hypocritical, and rightfully so, of course, because all the other nations, all the other peoples get their own country, but the German country, which at that point in time, at the end of World War I, remember, had still been a rather young country itself. That country, the German country, is getting punished, and it's getting divided up, and some of their peoples, who should rightfully so be in the German country if it was by ethnic division, by ethnicity, some of those people simply get left out of there. So he complains about that and says that this was a needless act of, malice by Wilson against the German people. And this is a very strong claim, because Gustav Stresemann, which was a chancellor and a minister of the exterior of the Weimar Republic between the two wars, says pretty much the same in a letter to Crown Prince Wilhelm, which is the son of Kaiser Wilhelm II, in 1925, just before the Treaty of Locarno, where Stresemann himself, pretty much the person in the entire history of the Weimar Republic who tried his hardest to keep the democratic order of Germany and keep the extremists such as Hitler and other extremist parties at that point in time out of power. He tried to preserve the Weimar Republic all he could, but even Stresemann said Germany needs to be able to protect the Germans abroad, that the Polish-German borders needs to be adjusted, and that Danzig, Upper Silesia, and the Polish corridor, which is the area that divided at that point in time Germany into two parts, need to be reincorporated into the German Empire, and that the Austrian annexation was secondary to that. Even Stresemann, who even was given a Nobel Peace Prize in trying to ameliorate relations with the French and the British, even he always talked about redrawing the borders in the east and incorporating those former German areas back into the country, because those acts of the Allies, severing those from Germany, were not at all consistent with the politic that they applied to the opponents of the Germans. As I mentioned before, the Belgians, the French, the Polish, the Italians, they all got their own states, and they all got all their people into their state, at least those areas where their people were in the majority, but Germany didn't get that. And that big hypocrisy by the Allies at the end of World War I is one of the biggest flaws of the Treaty of Versailles, and is a big leg for Hitler to stand on and present to his own people. And at that point in time, if you can be credible in telling your people that these foreign governments hate our people and they punish us more than anyone else, and they're not consistent with punishing us, those claims can rally one people against pretty much the entire world, as Hitler succeeded in doing. Also, in regards to Wilson, Hitler says that there's no authority of US presidents to speak on European border issues in general. So he says that Wilson, being one of the primary voices in redrawing the borders of Europe, is a big scam for the Germans, because that guy, as a US president, should keep his eyes on his own country. And he's not very wrong with that, as far as the United States have always proclaimed that they were going to stay out of international affairs if only they were left alone. But this is one of those cases where, although the United States probably helped the world by going against Germany in World War I and World War II, and probably for the better at that point in time, they did not really stick to what they were always preaching themselves, and therefore Hitler, again, seems rather credible in saying that the United States president shouldn't speak on European border issues at all. Thirdly, in regards to the United States, he talks quite a bunch about FDR in his speech. Of course, his speech was only given days after FDR declared war onto the Japanese Empire, and therefore Hitler focuses a ton on the sitting US president at that time. He claims that the American foreign policy at this point in time is simply creating protectorates and occupying countries all around the world, which is of course a bit of a stretch, but at that point in time, increasingly so, America had always been meddling in international affairs, and this is not something that Hitler liked them doing. And he said a very, very telling quote, which I want to repeat to you here. He says, America is fighting for the safety of its people in foreign continents. And think about that in modern context. This quote, fighting for the safety of America's own people in foreign continents, is a criticism that's been levied against the United States ever since that point in time, even more so after World War II. And Hitler's got a real point in talking about that, because the United States have engaged, especially after World War II, in countless wars where you can't really see a reason why they have to be fighting those wars and why they have to get involved in all of them. So they very much try to spread their influence across the world with some of these wars. And Hitler, in pointing that out, has again got a real good point that he presents to his own people. He also, in the main part of this section where he focuses on Roosevelt, he compares himself to FDR, and he says that Franklin Roosevelt is an elite, he's a financier, and he's a politician, whereas Hitler himself is a self-made man. He came from nothing, he's an ideologist, and he's a founder of a movement. So he's much closer to the people of his country that he lives in. And this is something he uses a lot in his speech to discredit the United States and Roosevelt in specific. He says, and I quote him here, "I shared my destiny with that of millions. Mr. Roosevelt only shared his with the top 10,000. And the idea of those top 10,000 or the top 0.1% and the elites ruling over an entire nation is something that's popular in conspiracy theories or in many people's opinions even to this day. So Hitler again presents himself as this man of the people who created a movement and rode it all the way to the top of the state and representing the people, whereas he says Roosevelt is simply another politician from an elite family, and he accuses him pretty much of not being in touch. He says both of them came to power in 1933 in situations of weak economy that were, according to Hitler, created by weak democracies. And of course, at that point in time, both countries weren't exactly economically strong, still recovering from the Great Depression. And it's true, both of them actually almost at the same point in time got into power in their own respective countries. Hitler claims that Roosevelt needs this war to pull America out of the economic crisis, just like Hitler had pulled Germany out of it from 1933 onwards. He says that Roosevelt's measures failed, and that he wants to distract from those failed inner politics by dragging the entire world into a war. Now, of course, this war isn't really triggered by Roosevelt. He declares a war onto Japan when the war has been already going in the Pacific theater and also in Europe for a couple of years. But Hitler says that Roosevelt needs this war, and although Roosevelt in reality didn't trigger this war, you can't deny that this war was a huge economic boost for the United States. And that's exactly what Hitler says, that they wanted that war to, after they had failed pulling their country out of the economic crisis on legal or usual means. He says that that's why America won this war and why they need it. He supports this idea by pointing out Roosevelt's opposition to the appeasement politics in Europe before the war and calls it warmongering, which of course is kind of a stretch, and Roosevelt was of course right in saying that those appeasement politics wouldn't lead to anything and that Hitler needed to be halted in a way more decisive way, more than just asking him to stop more territories. But Hitler says that he was making diplomacy with the European leaders at the time and that Roosevelt was always trying to instigate a conflict. Hitler adds that Roosevelt has as little authority to speak on European conflicts as European governments have to speak on conflicts between inner United States. I quote Hitler here, "I can assure you that no German head of state does nowadays or will ever spare a thought whether or not a US president acknowledges a European border." Now those are the types of lines with Hitler's rhetoric and his performance that can really get a crowd railed up against, in this case, the Americans, because he always portrays this whole situation as the German people being threatened by outside and the German people only wanting what's rightfully theirs. And that these Americans were, for seemingly no good reason, always trying to interfere with them. And he says, keep your nose out of our affairs. He says that Roosevelt antagonizes authoritarians, and Germany in particular, because they promote a workers' world as opposed to one controlled by the elites. This is again the exact same thing that we talked about earlier. He says that Germany is a land for the people, one for the workers, and that's obviously something that many authoritarians until then and since then have claimed and will always continue to claim, whereas those normal states, those normal democracies who have always those elected presidents, those elected leaders that always come out of the same elite families, groups, he doesn't really have a point there, because that doesn't justify a war at all or anything. But that's something that's pretty much just populism, and that's something that will always resonate well with the people. If you simply call the other guy an elitist and somebody who doesn't isn't in touch with the people, that's always gonna get you points. Last thing Hitler talks about concerning the United States is their fake neutrality in the war, where he lists examples such as Allied ships being repaired in US harbors, German crews being taken prisoner in US harbors, American ships engaging German U-boats in combat, US men being found on Allied ships, and even Roosevelt asking France to continue their war effort in order to receive double US supplies. Hitler points all these things out, and this again is one of the big points that many historians have already discussed. The United States constantly in World War I and in World War II supplying the Allies, helping them, and not declaring war onto Germany is kind of a dick move, if you will. They're at the same time, they want to have a cake and eat it too. They want to be neutral and not get attacked by Germany in the war, but also actively work against German war efforts and help out the Allies. So again, this was probably the right thing to do for the United States in terms of moral reasons and trying to keep Hitler contained. But it helps Hitler seem so much more legitimate in his own country when there's all these powers conspiring against your country and trying to keep your country down and not even declaring war on you. Of course, it seems like a defensive action by Hitler if there's all these people conspiring against him. Like we said earlier, Churchill asking the Russians to join the war. The United States constantly, throughout the entire war, supplying Russia and Britain and France with everything, with men, with money, with guns, with food, with anything they need. If that situation is going on, I mean, if you're a German and you feel that this war is a defensive one or a justified one, or just you taking back the stuff that you rightfully deserve, it seems so much more credible and so much more legit for Hitler to then attack those Allied powers and their allies. I want to quote Hitler one final time here, and he says, "I can't be offended by Franklin Roosevelt. I consider him just as mentally deranged as Woodrow Wilson was." You see, this is exactly the kind of route that Hitler was going for. In comparing himself as a person with Roosevelt, the US president, he always talks him down. He always talks how he's not legit, how he's just an elite, how he doesn't understand what the people need, and how he's always meddling in stuff that doesn't concern him or shouldn't concern him. And therefore, yeah, he can just he completely delegitimizes whatever the Allies say in pointing out hypocritical behavior by their part, or simply mismanagement of some situations by them that help him seem so much more credible. The fifth and final way of how the Allies helped legitimize Hitler is titled "Losing the War." And of course, I'm not blaming the Allies for losing the early stages of the war up until this point in 1941, because of course they weren't trying to lose the war. But again, all these things up to this point have been mistakes or simply things that the Allies had to do that as a byproduct helped Hitler out, and this is one of those things. Now it sounds kind of weird, of course, saying yeah, they shouldn't have lost the war, but the effect of Hitler's army having the success that it did helped him seem way more credible than he should have at home. Because remember, he did bring up some sort of legit reasons, as we discussed earlier, as to why he declared war on everybody. He claimed, yeah, the Allies in the West attacked us and the Russians in the East were always gonna attack us anyway, and the United States, they were always supplying and then interfering with our troops and our ships and so on. So he already legitimized why he declared war on everyone. But even the most reasonable German citizens, they must have thought, wait a minute, okay, all those people are mean to us, but why do we declare war on them? Isn't it asinine for us to have war against the entirety of Europe? But then Hitler's army winning all these battles, taking millions of prisoners of war from the Soviet Union in the east, and advancing so quickly through France and then through Russia in the east, and taking all of Europe seemingly without breaking a sweat, that fact alone helped Hitler seem so much more legit, because the Wehrmacht taking over the entire continent, that led to Hitler's claim that the German people were some divine race destined to rule Europe, didn't seem so outlandish anymore. Of course, that social Darwinism nowadays is an outdated idea, but at that point in time, Hitler had always been talking about how the Germans were the better people, and he had said that this war was necessary, and then by him actually winning the war, it was really hard for anyone inside of Germany to criticize that war effort anymore, as they were winning, and that declaration of war in the first place had seemingly been legitimate, as proposed earlier, while talking about the relationships Germany had with the Soviet Union, France, Great Britain, and the United States. And now, at the end of the video, I want to just recap real quick why we're talking about this, why it's crucially important to still remind ourselves to this day why those wars were started and how Hitler could get the support of so many people. Now, all these mistakes that the Allies made throughout all these affairs are in one way or another still replicated today in some situations. You know, you have conflicts such as in the Middle East, where you divide up the territory between Israel and the Palestinians in a way that doesn't exactly fit with the ethnic populations there, and multiple populations, multiple people lay claim to the same areas, and that was the exact same sort of an issue that was happening here with Germany and Poland. All those little things, all those hypocrisies of the Allies, all those bad phrases they may have used, all those alliances they formed around Germany, without Germany, and always portraying Germany as the evil, but never actually stepping in before it was too late. Those are the things we can still learn from up until this day. And those phrases that Hitler used, those speeches that he gave, they only seemed so legitimate and rallied the support of so many people because at the core of it, there were always some sparks of truth in there. So I thank you very much if you watched the video all the way to the end here. Always discuss with me in the comments if I missed something, if you want to add something, or if I got something wrong. Surely let me know. I'll read all the comments and respond if I can. And for now, that was the first video on my channel concerning the topic of history. When I'm passionate about a topic and I find something that's worth talking about, I'll surely release more of those. So stay tuned, and I'll see you guys next time. Stay safe out there.